Right, so we're going to briefly review the whole idea behind EKG. Disclaimer, I am not a physician. I am not an EKG technician. So I give you kind of very basic understanding how it works. Does that make sense? Feel free to ask questions. You'll probably embarrass me because I might not be able to answer them. And then we're going to talk about cardiac cycle. That's like a big thing. Cardiac cycle is a big thing. So EKG or ECG stands for electrocardiogram. So electrical activity of the heart is measured, right? Because electricity goes through the heart. So how does it look? We're gonna draw it first, and then we're gonna try to understand what is there. Okay, so this is your typical EKG. It's not up to scale, okay? It's not up to scale, so that's... So, what are those things? This is the P wave. This is the QRS complex. And this is the T wave. So what happens during each of these events? So we've got in P wave, this is the moment when basically SA node sends the signal across the atrium. And this is the moment of atrial depolarization. Now, when I say like look, here's the thing, listen up. It's not like the process, it's a beginning of atrial depolarization. So I drop here the beginning of, okay? Now, what happens during QRS complex? During QRS complex, okay, depolarization of atria is completed, and it's the beginning of atrial repolarization. And it is overlapping with the start of ventricular depolarization. Does that make sense? And then T wave. The start of ventricular repolarization. We're good? So, why do we care? For instance, we can say that, if you look at PR interval, you can see how long it takes from atrial depolarization to ventricular depolarization. Okay, make sense? So like, by looking at the EKG of a patient, we can we can measure how much time it takes for the impulse to go from SA node to Purkinje fibers. Does that make sense? There is a certain parameter, like it should be in a certain range. And if it takes longer than that, it means that the whole conduction system, there is something wrong with that. Maybe AV node is dysfunctional, maybe bundles are dysfunctional, it all can be. We good? Okay. Or we can measure the QT interval, and that will tell you the time that, Jesus. Hang on a second, I'm thinking. QT or ST. One of the intervals, either QT or ST. So the time that that your entire ventricle is depolarized. Does that make so? Basically, how long the contraction is, and these parameters, the shape of your EKG can change. For instance, in myocardial infarction and in various abnormalities of the heart. Does that make sense? So basically, again, what you need to appreciate, P wave is atrial depolarization. QRS complex is two overlapping events, atrial repolarization and ventricular depolarization. T wave, ventricular repolarization. So that brings us to several cardiac, well, I wouldn't say pathologies, but problems with EKG. And what can they tell you? So, for instance, first, tachycardia and bradycardia. Very, very fast contractions, very slow contractions. Now let me ask you this. Is that in itself a problem? If your heart beats very slowly or very fast? In itself, is that a problem? Not really, because if I'm like running and I have 150 BPM heart rate, am I in tachycardia? Sure. Is that a problem? No, I'm supposed to be. Does that make sense? So we can say that the patient has a tachycardia, which is unusual. For instance, you have a kid with asthma, personal experience. You have a kid with asthma. Measure heart rate, it can be 180. Is that normal? Of course not. But you can expect it because a poor child has, asthma. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's expected to have, like, child is supposed to have that high of a heart rate. Same goes for bradycardia. So for instance, if I have a heart rate of 40, probably I'm about to die. If Michael Phelps has a heart rate of 40, he's probably sleeping, watching TV. Does that make sense? Like, it's normal for him. Okay, we good? Now, a couple of other problems. So, first is SA block. Okay, SA block is the process in which SA node does not work. Okay? So if SA node doesn't work, which element of EKG we will not be able to see? Yep. So no P wave. Kind of expanding on this stuff. If there's no P wave, will your atria contract? So it's like 3 out of 10 question.
If
There's no P wave. If you are in an SA block, your SA node doesn't work, right? I'm going to put a little drawing here, okay? SA, AV, bundle, and then Purkinje fibers. So if your SA node doesn't work, okay, will your atria depolarize? No. If they don't depolarize, will they contract? No. If atria do not contract, are you going to die? Surprisingly, no. Atrial contraction isn't that important. Like, it's pretty weak, okay? What's gonna happen, like, if it's like transient, if you just have it like for 5 minutes so far, you're probably gonna feel like crap, but you're not dying, okay? You have some heart problems, but you're definitely not dying. Your ventricles are still moving the blood around. There are some problems with that movement, but they're still moving the blood, okay? Does that make sense? Now, AV block. Okay? So AV, remember, this node here, AV node, allows the signal to go all the way through the bundle to the Purkinje fibers. Does that make sense? All the way here. So if this AV node is somehow dysfunctional, I'm going to ask you up front, what do you think will not happen on the EKG? How would it look on EKG?
You would have like a weird QRS.
Okay.
Because wouldn't it still show the atrial repolarization?
It will, yeah. A little bit, yeah. In some cases, actually, it won't. But you're right, it will be weird QRS. And in some cases, you won't see it at all. So there are 3 degrees of AV block. It's also called a heart block. So, first degree, you have increased PR interval. So basically, think of it mechanistically. Look, if AV node is a little bit dysfunctional, it's going to take a signal more time to get through. It will still get through, it's just going to take it longer. Does that make sense? Are we clear?
Can you say that again?
So if this AV node, which is the only door, so to say, door between atria and ventricles, that's the only door. If that door is a little bit closed, it's going to take a signal more time to get into the ventricles. So the distance between P wave and QRS complex, the PR interval, will be longer. Okay? In the second degree, heart block, AV node occasionally closes completely. Just from time to time, not always, but from time to time, the signal cannot get through. Okay? Does that make sense? So like you're running into the door. So far, does that make sense? Like you're running into the door and suddenly it gets shut and you can't get through no matter what. So this is called a dropped beat. Now imagine that the door is just shut. So signal cannot get through, just no matter what. So first, as Emma mentioned, QRS complex will be weird, right? It will be weird. But let me ask you this, if signal from SA node cannot pass through AV, will your ventricles still contract? Will your ventricles have an electric activity? They will. You have bundle and Purkinje fibers. So this, like, it's basically like I'm slamming into that door, but I can't get out. So whoever is there, they will start, doing their own business. Does that make sense? So you're going to have kind of independent contractions in the atria and the ventricles. You see what I'm saying?
What causes the contraction? What does a bundle have?
Yeah, bundle is a bunch of pacemaker cells, it will just take over. Does that make sense? Now, will it be sufficient? No, we discussed that. The intrinsic contraction rate, that is, that bundle and Purkinje fibers can produce, is about 40 beats per minute in a regular individual. It is not enough. It's a bradycardia, okay? So it's a third-degree heart block. Does it make sense? Like, really bad bradycardia. So far, we good? Okay. Now, there are some other interesting conditions. I'm guiding you towards those, interesting conditions. And this is going to be the condition known as ectopic focus. So think of it this way. The communication between the nodes here is highly organized. The signal arises in SA node, reaches AV node, passes through it into the bundle and bundle branches, and eventually reaches the Purkinje fibers. Are you following me on this one? Good? So what is ectopic focus? Ectopic focus happens when basically you have pacemaker cells that are not in the conduction system. They just spread through the wall. Normally they play no role at all. But in some cases they can be stimulated. And imagine that suddenly another signal is generated here. Does that make sense? And that signal reaches AV node, and basically it creates the beat that is out of line, so to say. Does that make sense to you? No? Do you follow? Think of it, okay, this is going to be a poor analogy. This is going to be a poor analogy. But imagine that you are at the soccer practice, okay? And you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in line. And they practice passing. And you passing at this certain rhythm, okay? So I'm first to the second, second to the third, and you go in this rhythm and you catch it and it goes really smooth. And then some other person appears on the side and passes out of that sequence, out of that rhythm to the person number 2. And the person number 2 also goes on, right? And immediately continues after the person number 1. So it's kind of, ball goes through the chain out of line, out of rhythm. Better sense? This is an ectopic focus. Ectopic means out of space, out of line, out of place. Okay?
Is that like one player that just came out of nowhere?
Yeah, like one player came out of nowhere and just passed the ball.
And that's like that word.
Ectopic focus, yeah. Coming out of nowhere. It's absolutely normal. It can be stimulated by various stimulants. Nicotine, coffee, things like that. Okay? Moreover, to my knowledge, if you will take an average person, put this person on EKG, and we'll do EKG for an extended period of time, there's going to be an ectopic focus.
Is that like chest burn and stuff like that?
No, we can talk about chest burn later, the angina. No, it's just like, let's say I can relate to both experiences. Like you drink abominably huge amount of coffee. Okay, like you drank a liter of very strong coffee, right? Your heartbeat will go up, but sometimes it will be a little bit irregular. Does that make sense? So it will go like, you hear? So that extra, that's ectopic focus. That makes sense. It can be in the atrium, which is okay. It can be in the ventricle, which is less okay, but also kind of okay. That makes sense? It will just show as some weird overlap on EKG. But if ectopic focus is seen in the ventricle, it is often a preliminary sign of so-called ventricular fibrillation. So this brings us to the fibrillation story. So what is fibrillation? In fibrillation, in atrial fibrillation, cardiac cells contract asynchronously, suddenly. Does that make sense? Look at my hand. So if this is an atrium, normally it would contract like this, right? As a whole thing. In atrial fibrillation, it will be something like that. Contractions are still produced, right? But they are produced so different parts of the atrium are contracting at different times. So it cannot produce actual, sustainable, productive squeezing force. Make sense? Now, if on EKG, basically what you're going to see is weirdly shaped Cprs complex. That's it. A little bit of T, a little bit. But P wave will be basically gone because it's just a mess. Okay? Is it life-threatening? Not immediately, no. There are people who live with atrial fibrillation. Does that make sense? Because
Are you born with it, or can you get
usually it's the result of heart disease of some sort. So heart attack or coronary heart disease, something like that, yeah, results in atrial. Eventually people develop it. Now ventricular fibrillation is a little bit different. So in ventricular fibrillation, your ventricle contracts like this. It cannot produce any proper squeezing force, which means blood doesn't get ejected into either pulmonary or systemic circuit, which means blood doesn't get moving. Does that make sense? This is what we say, like, heart stopped. Does that make sense to you?
Is there like another word for that? Or
No.
is that-
I mean, no, it's just when, oh, his heart stopped.
It means the blood stopped flowing.
Ventricular fibrillation and blood doesn't flow. Because there's going to be electrical activity, just asynchronous. Does it make sense to you all? So this is when like people do like and drop on the ground, right? So what do we do in this case? Huh? CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. So if you do it by hands, essentially you have to memorize staying alive, at least the course, and you have to pump. Pulmonary, by the way, most recent studies show that pulmonary resuscitation is not necessary. Whether or not you're breathing into it, that's fine. But just, pumping the blood. Basically what you do, the heart goes absolutely electrically in ventricular fibrillation, heart goes absolutely bonkers. And by just pressing on the chest, you're manually moving the blood around. And it can last for quite a while. Now if you have an AED, I can never remember. D stands for defibrillator, that's what I remember. AE, I don't remember what it stands for. This electrical thing, right, with two pads. When you electrocute a person with ventricular fibrillation, there are a couple of misconceptions. So what do you think happens when you electrocute the person?
Doesn't it shock the heart or something?
And what happens? Right after you shock to the heart. What happens to the heart?
Does
Huh?
the blood start to flow again?
Not necessarily, no. But what happens to the heart right after you shock it?
Is it depolarized?
Well, pretty much. Well, actually, it's not depolarized. It's actually opposite. It's hyperpolarized, which means what happens to it on like physical level?
It would relax, so it's like stop.
That's the whole point of shocking, is to stop the heart completely, erase all cardiac activity. I compare it to a lunch late that I was a witness to in third grade, and there are a bunch of third graders in the lunchroom like chatting, it's just a noise. And then this lunch lady stands up and says, "Quiet." Well, she didn't say, she yelled, "Quiet," and there's a dead silence. So she erased all the activity, right? Same happens with those pads. They stop the heart. If pacemaker cells can start again in an organized fashion, great. Then you will have normal heartbeat. Does that make sense?
So it stops the heart, and then your heart will have to like.
Maybe it will restart, maybe it will not. Nobody knows.
So, and when they constantly do it like again and again, they're constantly just stopping it.
Yeah. They don't even know if it restarted, really. Okay.
What's the purpose of doing like higher voltage each time?
That I don't know. I don't really know. Maybe one of my sort of hypothesis, maybe lower voltage does not completely erase all electrical activity. So basically, we don't think of it this way. You have a person on the floor, I don't know, in the shopping mall, and you do, defibrillation. You don't really know what's going on inside, do you? Like, you don't really know what happens to the heart. You're just hoping that the higher voltage maybe helps. What is the percentage of successful defibrillations according to the movies? People actually calculated.
Like when they actually have to shock.
Like in the movies, like they shock, like House MD, I don't know, Grey's Anatomy, I guess. Never watched a single episode, but shock it and just person goes back to life. What's the percentage of successful CPRs?
Usually works in the movies.
Yeah, about 70%. What is the percentage of successful CPRs in real life? Any guess? Huh?
30.
Too optimistic. It's about 5%. So basically, if the person drops dead with the heart, probably the person's going to stay this way. Okay? That makes sense? Ventricular, I listened to a podcast by ER physicians that have to do it, and they say, it's about 5%. 1 out of 20. So it's very like last hope that is not particularly high, Does that make sense? So know the basics and know what happens like on the basic level. So if I ask you, what happens in an AV block, I'm not going to ask you to know like first, second, third degree of the, AV block. Just in general, can P wave be erased? So, sorry, not P wave. Can PR interval increase? Yeah. Okay. Can you have a dropped beat? Yeah. Can your bundle take over as a pacemaker? Yes. Can Purkinje fibers take over as a pacemaker? Yes. Does that make sense? Good? Okay.